In the summer of 1695, a merchant vessel called the Gunsway sat still in the Indian Ocean haze, a floating fortress owned by the Mughal Empire, stuffed with gold, silver, and the treasures of hundreds of Muslim pilgrims returning from Mecca. The ship's captain thought himself safe. He had cannon, armed guards, and the full authority of Emperor Aurangzeb behind him. None of it mattered. A single pirate ship came out of the haze, and before the sun had climbed much higher, it was over. The haul was somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 pounds sterling, the single richest pirate raid in recorded history. But the captain of that ship, an Englishman named Henry Every, did not sail home. He sailed south, to a forgotten island off the coast of Madagascar, where a quiet, calculating former criminal from Jamaica had built something extraordinary. A world with no king, no law, and no flag. A shadow kingdom that ran for a decade and changed the Indian Ocean forever. Welcome to Dead Man's Shore. I'm Jack. Subscribe if you haven't, drop a comment telling us what surprises you most, and let's get into it. To understand Madagascar's rise, you need to know one man, Thomas Tew, a Rhode Island privateer who in 1693 talked his crew into abandoning their original mission and sailing around the Cape of Good Hope to raid Mughal shipping near the Red Sea. The crew voted unanimously. Tew took a Mughal vessel with almost no resistance, and each sailor walked away with roughly 3,000 pounds. A lifetime's wages. On the way home, Tew stopped at a small island called Sainte-Marie, where a man named Adam Baldridge had built something no pirate had ever had before. A permanent, fortified base in the middle of the ocean. That stop changed everything. What he found there was perfect. Sainte-Marie was only about 60 kilometers long, narrow and densely forested, sitting about 10 kilometers off the northeastern coast of Madagascar proper. Its harbor was sheltered and deep, easily capable of accommodating large ships. The local Malagasy people were not hostile, though they had their own conflicts with tribes from the mainland that frequently raided them. Baldridge saw an opportunity. He offered the islanders his guns, his leadership, and his willingness to help them fight off the mainland raiders. They welcomed him. In return, he began building. Over the next few years, Baldridge constructed something remarkable. On a hill overlooking the harbor, he built a fort bristling with 40 cannon, enough firepower to discourage any Royal Naval vessel from attempting a direct assault. Below the fort, he built warehouses. He established a trading post. He cultivated gardens and kept livestock. He set up a supply chain that stretched all the way back to New York, where a wealthy merchant named Frederick Phillips, also a member of the New York Colonial Council, which tells you something about how openly this was done, was sending him ships laden with gunpowder, rum, tools, sailcloth, rigging, boots, clothing, and books. Everything a pirate crew, exhausted from months at sea, could possibly want. And in exchange, the pirates brought Baldridge their plunder: Indian silks, Mughal gold and silver, spices, gems, the accumulated cargo of a dozen intercepted vessels. Baldridge bought it from them at a significant discount. He was, after all, the only buyer on the island, and sent it back to Phillips in New York, who sold it at an equally significant profit. The whole arrangement was elegant, mutually beneficial, and completely outside the reach of any legal authority on Earth. Baldridge's fort overlooked a harbor that was quickly becoming one of the busiest in the Indian Ocean. At the height of the operation, his warehouses held more wealth than most European city treasuries. He had a harem of local women, servants, political influence over the surrounding Malagasy chiefs, and an income that would have made London merchants weep with envy. He was not, to be clear, a particularly likable man, but he was a genuinely capable one, and the shadow kingdom he built in the last decade of the 17th century would shape the history of an entire ocean. Here is something worth pausing on for a moment. While all of this was happening, while Baldridge was building his fort and Tu was sailing his pirate round, the Mughal Empire was at the absolute height of its power. Emperor Aurangzeb ruled from Delhi over a population of roughly 150 million people, controlled revenues that dwarfed those of England and France combined, and commanded an army that no European power of the era could have hoped to defeat on land. He was not a man you wanted as an enemy. And yet, the pirates of Madagascar were making him one, raid by raid, season by season. Because the Mughal economy was deeply tied to the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca that all Muslims of sufficient means were expected to undertake at least once, every year, enormous fleets of pilgrim ships sailed from the great port of Surat in western India, loaded not just with pilgrims, but with the enormous amounts of gold, silver, and trade goods required for the journey. They passed through the Red Sea. They anchored at Mocha and Jeddah. They returned months later with whatever riches they had accumulated in trade. And they were, for much of their voyage, entirely exposed. The pirates understood this perfectly. The mouth of the Red Sea, a narrow bottleneck where every ship entering or leaving the Arabian Sea was forced to pass through a confined stretch of water, became what pirates called the choke point. If you could position yourself there at the right time, in the right season, the targets would practically sail up to your guns. Thomas too had proved this in 1693. Henry Every proved it even more spectacularly with the Gunzway in 1695. And the key to reaching that choke point, surviving long enough to use it, and escaping afterward, was Madagascar. Think of Sainte-Marie in this period the way you might think of a forward operating base, a military term that describes a temporary, semi-permanent position far forward of home territory, from which operations are launched and to which forces return for resupply and rest. Baldridge's fort was exactly that. Pirates would sail from the Caribbean or from colonial American ports like Newport, Rhode Island and New York. They would stop at Sainte-Marie to take on supplies, make repairs, and gather intelligence. Baldridge usually knew which ships were coming and going from Surat, who was carrying what, and which captains were likely to offer resistance. Then they would proceed north and west toward the Red Sea. After a successful raid, they would come back to Sainte-Marie, sell their plunder, rest, and begin planning the next voyage. The names that passed through Sainte-Marie in those years read like a who's who of Golden Age piracy. Thomas too visited in 1693, when Baldridge was still building his operation. Henry Every anchored there in the aftermath of the Gunzway attack in 1695. William Kidd, the infamous Captain Kidd, who had started his career as a licensed privateer and ended it as the most wanted man in the English-speaking world, arrived at Sainte-Marie in April of 1698 aboard his leaking, barely seaworthy adventure galley, with the stolen cargo of the Mughal vessel Kedah Merchant in his hold, and the knowledge that he was already being hunted. Robert Culliford, a pirate who had once quite literally stolen one of Kidd's ships while Kidd was on shore, was already anchored in the harbor when Kidd arrived. Kidd apparently introduced himself to Culliford and his crew by announcing, with a certain candor, that he was as bad as they. Most of his remaining crew promptly abandoned him and joined Culliford. But here is what's interesting. It was not just individual pirates passing through. There was a genuine community forming. Pirates who had made their money and had nowhere safe to go back to began staying, They built houses on the island. They learned the Malagasy language, or at least enough of it to negotiate and trade. They formed relationships with local women, some of which were formal marriages negotiated with the approval of local chiefs, effectively creating family ties to the Malagasy ruling families. Mixed-race children were born. And as the community grew, it began to develop its own internal structure, its own hierarchies, its own informal laws, its own economy. The Malagasy people, for their part, were not passive players in this. They had their own complex political world, with dozens of competing chieftains, ongoing conflicts over cattle and territory, and the sophisticated understanding of how to use foreign arrivals to their own advantage. A pirate with firearms and military knowledge was an enormously valuable ally in the constant low-level warfare of the Malagasy interior. Several pirates rose to genuine prominence in these tribal structures, not as outsiders imposing their will, but as adopted war leaders who had demonstrated their usefulness in combat and their reliability as partners. They were given titles, land, authority. Some became chiefs in everything but name. And in this atmosphere, the myth of Libertalia was born. You have probably heard the name. It was supposedly a pirate utopia somewhere on the coast of Madagascar, a perfect, egalitarian republic where pirates lived as free men, abolished rank and privilege, and created a genuinely just society. It was described in wonderful, tantalizing detail by a writer called Captain Charles Johnson in his 1624 book, A General History of the Pirates. The story involved a French idealist captain named Misson and an Italian former priest named Caraccioli, who together founded this paradise, attracted hundreds of like-minded men to it, and ran it for years before it was destroyed in a surprise attack. The problem is that most serious historians now believe Libertalia was almost certainly a fabrication, or at the very least, a dramatic exaggeration of real events. There is no documentary evidence, no ship logs, no depositions, no colonial correspondence that mentions Libertalia by name from the period when it was supposed to exist. The name Misson does not appear in any record of actual piracy, and Captain Charles Johnson, who may have been Daniel Defoe writing under a pseudonym, though even that is debated, was writing 30 years after the fact, combining real events with obvious invention. What Libertalia likely represents is a romanticized version of the real pirate communities that did exist on Madagascar. Messier, more violent, more complicated, but also more genuinely interesting than any utopia. Do you think Libertalia was real? Or is it one of the great pirate myths? Let us know in the comments. We genuinely love hearing what you think about these questions, and your answers are always more interesting than you might expect. What is not mythological at all is the impact that Madagascar's pirate community had on global politics. Because when Henry Every took the Gunsway in 1695, Emperor Aurangzeb did not simply absorb the loss. He was furious. Genuinely, dangerously furious. He closed every English trading post in his empire. He had the agents of the East India Company arrested. He threatened to expel all European merchants from Mughal territory permanently. The company, which depended entirely on Mughal goodwill for its survival and profit, was suddenly facing existential crisis because of a single pirate from Devon. The East India Company's men in London lobbied Parliament furiously. The Crown was pressured to act. Every was declared the most wanted man in England and remained so despite enormous rewards for the rest of his life. He was never caught. By 1697, Adam Baldridge's time on Sainte-Marie was running out, and it ended the way a lot of things ended in the pirate world, through betrayal and through his own greed catching up with him. The specific incident is recorded in multiple sources, including William Kidd's own later testimony. Baldridge, it seems, had at some point invited a significant number of Sainte-Marie Islanders, men, women, and children, aboard ships in the harbor. He then sold them into slavery, sending them to the French island of Mascarene, known today as Réunion. When the remaining islanders found out what had happened to their families and neighbors, the reaction was immediate. The pirate settlement on Sainte-Marie descended into chaos. Several pirates were killed in the uprising. Baldridge himself, forewarned somehow, escaped to the American colonies. He eventually turned up in New York, gave a carefully worded deposition to the colonial authorities designed to minimize his own culpability, and lived out the rest of his life as a legitimate, more or less, merchant. He died in his 70s. The settlement he left behind did not collapse entirely. A man named Edward Welch took over the fort and the warehouses. Though without Baldridge's supply pipeline to Frederick Phillips, he had considerably less success, and the pirates who had been using Sainte-Marie as a base did not simply vanish. Some continued raiding. Some settled more permanently into the Malagasy interior. Some drifted back to the Caribbean or to colonial ports in America, where sympathetic merchants and governors still existed, though in dwindling numbers. But the political pressure to end Madagascar's pirate kingdom was building rapidly, and it came from the very top. On the 8th of December, 1698, not from Queen Anne, who would not come to the throne until 1702, but from King William III, an extraordinary royal proclamation was issued. It offered a pardon to any pirate operating east of the Cape of Good Hope who would surrender themselves to a Royal Navy captain named Thomas Warren. The pardon was genuine, and it was specifically targeted at the Madagascar community. Two pirates, Henry Every and William Kidd, were explicitly excluded by name, which tells you something about how seriously the Crown took those particular cases. Warren sailed to Sainte-Marie in January of 1699. The Act of Grace had technically already expired by the time he arrived, but Warren stretched the deadline and managed to obtain the surrender of several pirates, including Robert Culliford. The outcome was not exactly reassuring to anyone thinking of taking future pardons. Most of the men who surrendered were tried and hanged anyway. Culliford himself testified against his former colleagues and managed to survive. The others were not so fortunate. Still, the combination of the pardon and the increasing presence of Royal Navy patrols in the Indian Ocean was having an effect. The first great wave of Madagascar piracy, the pirate round of the 1690s, was ending. By 1711, fewer than 100 pirates remained on the island, many of them old, sick, and stranded, having spent their plunder and with nowhere to go and no means to get there. The warehouses were empty, the fort was crumbling. The flourishing shadow economy that had connected a Jamaican fugitives trading post to the drawing rooms of New York and London had collapsed as completely as if it had never existed. Except, of course, for the people it had left behind. Because the deepest and most lasting legacy of the Madagascar pirate kingdom was not the gold or the silks or the ransacked Mughal ships. It was human. The mixed-race communities that had formed on the island during the 1690s and early 1700s were real, and they persisted. The children of pirate fathers and Malagasy mothers grew up speaking both languages, moving between worlds, occupying a unique and often powerful position in the island's social structure. Some of them became significant political figures in their own right. Some of them remembered the stories of where their fathers had come from and what they had done. And into this world, in 1720, came the last and perhaps the most colorful of Madagascar's pirate kings, James Plantain. Plantain was English, born in Jamaica, and had spent his early career aboard the pirate vessel of a captain named Edward England, whose flotilla in 1720 captured a well-armed East India Company ship called the Cassandra in a hard-fought battle off the Malabar coast of India. After dividing the plunder, the pirates sailed to Madagascar. Some sailed on. Some accepted pardons. Plantain stayed. He moved to a bay on the northeastern coast of Madagascar called Ranter Bay, the site of the modern village of Rantabe, and he began building. What Plantain constructed at Ranter Bay was something closer to a genuine feudal territory than anything Baldridge had managed at Sainte-Marie. Baldridge had always been fundamentally a merchant. His power rested on supply chains and commercial relationships. Plantain was something different. He spent his plunder on guns, gunpowder, and the patient cultivation of alliances with the local Malagasy chiefs. He offered military support to friendly groups. He organized raids against their enemies, using firearms to tip the balance in the constant low-level warfare of the Madagascar interior. And he demanded loyalty in return. Real, personal loyalty, not merely commercial cooperation. He declared himself, with considerable self-confidence, the king of Ranter Bay. He maintained what contemporary accounts describe as a substantial household. He kept multiple Malagasy wives, with at least one wife of mixed English and Malagasy descent, whom he reportedly favored above all others. He had a private force of armed men. He conducted his own diplomacy with neighboring groups and with passing ships, trading food, water, and slaves captured in his wars for guns, rum, and whatever else he needed. A Royal Navy squadron that visited Madagascar in 1722, searching for several other pirates, was effectively received by Plantain as a visiting delegation would be received by a territorial ruler. He told the naval officers that the men they were looking for had long since left the island. He invited them in for refreshments. They went away satisfied. The accounts of Plantain's kingdom that survive paint a vivid, strange, and genuinely unsettling picture. He was not, by any measure, a benevolent ruler. His treatment of those he considered enemies or captives was consistently harsh, and the slave-taking that funded his military operations was systematic. He was operating in a world where such things were done, and he did them without apparent hesitation. But he was also, by all accounts, genuinely embedded in the Malagasy world in a way that few Europeans of his era managed. He spoke the language. He understood the political structure. He had genuine allies and genuine enemies, earned through years of personal dealings, not simply imposed through superior firepower. It is a story without a satisfying moral. Plantain was not a hero. He was not even particularly admirable. But he was real, and he was there. And for nearly a decade, he ruled a piece of the world that no European government claimed, and no navy controlled. Every kingdom ends. The question is always how, and how quickly, and whether anything survives it. The first great wave of the Madagascar pirate kingdom ended in the years between 1698 and 1705, driven by a combination of forces that worked together rather than in isolation. The royal pardon of 1698 removed some pirates from the equation, though, as we've noted, it did so in a way that bred deep suspicion of future pardons among those who watched their surrendering colleagues hanged anyway. Royal Navy patrols increased steadily through the early 1700s. The East India Company, stung by the political disaster caused by Henry Every's attack on the Gunzway, and under intense pressure to protect its Mughal trade relationships, began providing armed escorts to the most valuable ships on the Indian Ocean routes. It became harder, more dangerous, and less profitable to raid the Red Sea convoys. There was also the simple, brutal attrition of the life itself. Madagascar in the late 17th century was not a healthy place for Europeans. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical fevers cut down men who had survived cannon fire and storms at sea. Pirates who had arrived in their 20s found themselves old and sick before they reached 40. The treasure they had accumulated often drained away faster than they could have imagined, spent on food, rum, weapons, bribes, and the constant necessities of survival in an uncontrolled environment with no infrastructure and no institutions. By 1711, as we mentioned, fewer than 100 pirates remained on the island. They were described by visitors as wretched, impoverished, and barely surviving. The second wave, the period of the early 1720s, which brought Plantain and others like Christopher Condent and Edward England back to Madagascar's shores after Woodes Rogers cleaned out the pirate haven of Nassau in the Bahamas, was briefer and ultimately less significant. The Royal Navy was stronger. The East India Company was better organized. The political will to end piracy had hardened across every major European government. And the Malagasy people themselves, who had spent 30 years dealing with armed foreigners, had developed their own responses, sometimes cooperative, sometimes fiercely hostile, and always driven by their own calculations rather than any loyalty to the pirate community. Plantain's kingdom at Ranter Bay collapsed in 1728, not from a naval assault or a royal pardon, but from an internal uprising. His enslaved population and a coalition of hostile Malagasy groups rose against him simultaneously. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and unable to hold his position. He escaped with his life, his favorite wife, and whatever portable valuables he could carry. He sailed to India, where he took service in the Maratha Navy under the great Admiral Kanoji Angre, a man who was himself, from the East India Company's perspective, essentially a pirate, though the Marathas considered him a perfectly legitimate naval commander. Plantain died in Maratha service sometime before April of 1737. The treasure he was said to have buried on the Madagascar coast, and the stories of it are very specific, involving buried chests, marked trees, and exact locations, was never found. Or, if it was found, no one who found it ever said so publicly. Edward England, the great pirate captain who had once commanded a flotilla that included Plantain among his crew, fared even worse. When the Royal Navy squadron visited Ranter Bay in 1722, the officers noted that a haggard, obviously unwell man was present in Plantain's settlement, who was identified as England. He had been deposed from his command by his own crew some time before, reportedly because he was considered too merciful to the captains of ships they took, and had been left on Madagascar with nothing. He died there, probably in 1723, in poverty. The man who had once commanded one of the most feared pirate flotillas in the Indian Ocean ended his days as a dependent of a self-styled pirate king, who was himself on borrowed time. By the early 1730s, it was over. The last pirates died or drifted away. The fort that Baldridge had built on the hill above Sainte-Marie's harbor fell into disrepair, its 40 cannon rusting in the tropical heat. The warehouses rotted. The jungle moved back in. The Madagascar jungle does not hesitate. And within a generation, the physical evidence of the kingdom was almost entirely gone. What remained was human: the mixed-race communities, the oral histories, the persistent legends of buried treasure, and the cemetery. That cemetery still exists. It sits near the village on Sainte-Marie, and it holds roughly 30 stone markers, many of them still bearing the carved skull and crossbones of the Jolly Roger. It is, as far as anyone has been able to determine, the only verified pirate cemetery in the world. The names on the stones are mostly too weathered to read now, but they were real men, these names, not mythological figures, not romanticized heroes, but actual human beings who sailed extraordinary distances, made extraordinary choices, and died in an extraordinary place that they had, for a brief and improbable decade, made their own. There is something in the story of Madagascar's pirate kingdom that resists easy summary. It was not, as legend would sometimes have it, a utopia of freedom and equality. It was violent, exploitative, and built substantially on the suffering of people, Malagasy people, enslaved people, the passengers of raided ships, who had no voice in its construction. Adam Baldridge, who built the foundation of the whole enterprise, ended his days as a legal merchant in New York after selling his own neighbors into slavery. James Plantain, who built its last and strangest chapter, maintained his kingdom through armed force and systematic exploitation until his own people rose against him. And yet, for a decade, roughly the 1690s and then again briefly in the early 1720s, this genuinely stateless space existed. No king claimed it, no law governed it in any formal sense. The men who lived there created their own hierarchies, their own economies, their own version of order out of what was essentially nothing. They married into the communities around them, learned languages, fought wars, fathered children who would grow up to be something entirely new. It was messy and contradictory and often terrible. But it was also, in a strange and unrepeatable way, its own kind of world. Before we close this chapter of the story, we want to hear from you. Do you think a place like Madagascar's pirate kingdom could ever have become something stable and lasting? Could it have evolved into something recognized, something legitimate? Or was it always going to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? Leave your answer in the comments below. There are no wrong answers here, and the conversation you start might end up in a future episode. The question of what happened to the individual men who passed through Madagascar's pirate kingdom is one of history's more absorbing puzzles. William Kidd went back to the Caribbean, tried to negotiate his way out of the charges against him using his Quetta merchant as a bargaining chip, watched the ship sink or be burned before he could use it, and was arrested in Boston in 1699 by the very patron he thought was protecting him, the Earl of Bellamont, who was simultaneously under investigation for his own connections to piracy and needed to demonstrate his respectability. Kidd was taken to London, tried on charges that most legal historians now consider deeply questionable, and hanged in May of 1701. His body was tarred and displayed in an iron cage at Tilbury on the Thames, where it remained for 3 years as a warning to sailors. The irony was heavy. Kidd had been, in the beginning, entirely legitimate, a licensed privateer acting on orders from some of the most powerful men in England. Thomas, too, who had started the whole pirate round, did not survive long enough to see what it became. He went back to the Red Sea in 1695, the same summer Evri took the Gunsway, and was killed when a cannon shot from a Mughal vessel struck him during an attempted boarding. He was 40 years old. His crew completed the attack without him and eventually made their way back to the Caribbean with their plunder. His first mate, Robert Glover, ended up in Baldridge's settlement on Sainte-Marie, where he was among the pirates killed in the uprising of 1697. Henry Evri, the man who took the Gunsway, who was the most wanted man in England, who sparked a diplomatic crisis that threatened the East India Company's entire existence, vanished completely. There are reports he made it back to England in disguise, tried to collect money from merchants who had financed his voyage, was cheated by them, and ended his days in poverty in the west of England. There are other reports that he reached the Bahamas or Ireland or the coast of West Africa. No one knows for certain. The man who pulled off the greatest pirate heist in history left no confirmed final chapter. He simply disappeared into the historical record, as entirely as if the Indian Ocean had swallowed him. Which, in a sense, it had. The ocean takes everything eventually. The ships rot at anchor. The forts crumble. The warehouses empty out. The jungle comes back. and all that's left are the stories. And 30 weathered gravestones on a hillside in Madagascar, with skulls and crossbones that the rain has not yet managed to completely erase. Thank you for sailing with us today on Dead Man's Shore. If you made it this far, you already know this channel is for people who want the real story. Not the cleaned up version, not the Hollywood version, but the actual, complicated human history of the sea and the people who lived on it. If that's you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what you'd like us to cover next.